Hey everyone, thanks for joining us for another episode of the Ghost Furnace. I am Bond and I'm here with my cohort Nick Pennsylvania. How you doing, Nick?
I'm very excited this evening.
Yeah, so am I, because we are joined with a third guest. We're here with Jim Harold. How you doing, Jim?
I'm doing well. Thanks, guys, for having me on the show. And I could tell we were kindred spirits, not to steal from that popular TV show, but we're kindred spirits. We were talking about radios and geeky stuff before we got started here. So I'm looking forward to talking about spooky stuff.
Yeah, no, great minds think alike. Absolutely. So, for those of you who aren't familiar, Jim Harold has a series of podcasts, books, and other media. He's been podcasting since 2005. So, kind of like the OG of paranormal podcasting, even podcasting in general. Um, you guys probably know his main podcasts, which are the Campfire and the Paranormal Podcast, but also has a slew of other ones that have been very successful over the years. And kind of in that time, collected thousands of stories, interviewed thousands of guests over the entire spectrum of the paranormal, true crime, just kind of weird stuff in general, all the things all of our listeners are very much into. And because of that, we think that Jim brings a very unique perspective. It's kind of important because it almost is the intersection of like folklore and entertainment by collecting so many stories. Um, and also just on a kind of personal level, I think, Jim, I think you really do kind of set the standard for how to respectfully listen to experiencers and interview people in a field that can be kind of touchy when people are trying to share their stories and everything. So that's something that I've always really respected, and we're just very excited to speak with you this evening.
Well, thank you, and thank you for that. Those kind remarks. I do really go out of my way to try to be respectful of people. When people come on the Campfire show, which is probably my most popular show, Jim Harold's Campfire, I'm not going to attack them and say, well, really, I mean, if
Hmm.
somebody came into your home and was a guest, would you, attack them and try to cross-examine them and, to date myself, Mike Wallace them?
Right.
No, you would say, well, tell me what happened. And that's the kind of vibe we try to get on the Campfire and try to be respectful of everyone. And I think people like that, and it seems to resonate.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that, that's kind of, like you said, something that people don't get everywhere. So really appreciate that perspective. And through all those stories, you've gathered so much, and that's kind of what we want to talk about this evening. So I know we have a series of questions for you, and then we also want to share some stories
Sure.
because you've accumulated a lot of them over the years. So Nick, how about I know you have probably the first question of the evening.
Yeah, so just to kind of go with that, I'm more of a recent. Brendan has been telling me to listen, and I've been listening more earnestly to the Campfire in particular. And I was fascinated with you because the the longevity's one thing, but you really, because of that, have become this depository of people's stories and experiences. And I'm really curious a few things about how they've affected you. How do you see how they've impacted you? What maybe are you more skeptical about now than you were in the past? And maybe what are you giving maybe a little bit more credence to than maybe you did before earlier in your journey here?
Well, I will say, people will say, and the whole time I've been doing this, the end of July will be 19 years. And people say, well, what have you figured out and what have you learned? And on one hand, not a lot. When I came into this, when I talk about the paranormal, I'm a big tent guy. I believe in ghosts, UFOs, cryptids, all of it. Kind of are in that tent for me. But when I started out, I was like, okay, ghosts are dead people, UFOs are aliens, cryptids, if they exist, are animals.
Hmm.
It was like I kind of have very definite ideas, and I walked into it as a believer. I am still a believer. Doesn't mean that everything can possibly be true. Unfortunately, there's people out there who, and I'm not referring to my campfire callers, but just in general, there's people who make things up. There's hoaxers. There's people who are well-meaning, but they misinterpret things. But then if you whittle all that away, I think there's a core of people who have really experienced something that might be paranormal. So to your question, what have I become more skeptical about? Maybe more skeptical that the answers are as easy as I thought they were at the beginning. I'll give you an example. And my thinking on this has even changed in the last 2 or 3 years. UFOs. I always assumed, okay, you've got, unfortunately, some percentage of people who hoax. Probably a large percentage of people who see something in the sky and they're misinterpreting it. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, you do have military stuff. When they were developing the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71, people would see those things sometimes, and they were UFOs to them, right? But they weren't space aliens.
I remember the first time seeing a stealth bomber. It was the early 90s over the Peace Bridge coming back from Canada.
Yeah.
And if you hadn't been aware of that was a thing, and I'm sure some people did see it, you didn't see it until it was right on you. It was
right,
one of the craziest things.
Yeah. So, but that leaves a significant amount of reports where I believe people are seeing something that's real and is not explicable by, say, ordinary means. So what are those? Now, I do think there's still a possibility that there might be ET, but, we just saw some researchers, I think from Harvard, come out and say, hey, this crypto-terrestrial thing, which has been around for years, the ultra-terrestrials, goes back to people like Mac Tonnies, who passed away, that maybe if there are beings, they're not out there, but they're here. Maybe they live in the deep ocean. Now, a few years ago, and I was familiar with those ideas, I kind of thought, nah, that's not it. But the more I think about it, if you look at transmedium craft, for example, with UFOs that easily go from the ocean to the sky and those kind of things, maybe they're here, maybe they're all around us, maybe they're interdimensional. So, before I was very certain, like, oh, they exist, and, the ones we can't explain, they're aliens. And now I'm not quite as sure. That's just one example.
Yeah. Now what's an example, I guess, maybe of something that, like, the volume of stories that you've got has been something that you didn't expect? Like, I think people a lot of times think, like, oh, like you said, every ghost is obviously a dead person. It's like an apparition,
Right.
I know from listening to your show a lot, one of the things that comes up is the idea of doppelgangers.
Oh, yeah.
And, like, you wouldn't think there's that many stories, but you have tons of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's one of the most sinister things. Actually, as we're recording this, I just released, and I kid you not, episode 666 of the Campfire.
Oh,
and that's the title, episode 666, because it didn't really
keep it simple.
So what I did was I went back and found some of the creepiest, like, devilish stories that we've had over the years. Because if you listen to the show, typically it's a mix. We have some spooky, scary stories, and we have the heartwarming stories about grandma coming to visit and those kind of things.
Right.
Because I think the paranormal really is like that. I think it's a continuum. I don't think it's all bad, and I don't think it's all good. I think it's a mix, just like our life here. But nevertheless, this story was particularly creepy. This woman's lived in, like, this army quarters or house that I think was very old, and her husband was stationed nearby in an Air Force base. But they lived in the house. He didn't live on base. So anyway, they got this house. It was very old, and all this creepy stuff started to happen. So this one morning, she's in bed and she feels her husband next to her, and she's looking at the clock and saying, wait, he's usually out for a jog by now. What's going on? And then she sees his face, and it's like a slightly off kilter version of her husband.
Ugh.
So she's basically spooning with some kind of demon. And the way she knows that is because she starts to say a prayer, get thee behind me, whoever, in the name of, and her husband says, stop doing that.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah. So spooning with a demon, and the story goes on and on. That's actually the first story on episode 666.
Oh, there we go.
And there's like an hour and a half of that, but of different ones. But the point is, is that doppelganger thing you mentioned is really sinister, because what it seems like these doppelgangers do, because I always thought, oh, I saw your doppelganger. It's like you see somebody that
Right.
looks like, they appear to be entities or something that mimics a loved one. And it does it in the most insidious way. Sometimes it's just the voice. Sometimes it's like spooning with the demon story. We had one years ago, very early in the campfire, and it was a young woman. She was talking about when she was in her teenage years. And her mom, they lived in a trailer, a modest trailer they lived in. So anyway, one day, this young woman walks in the trailer. Her mom tells a story. The one woman walks in the trailer, the young woman, the school bus has dropped her off. She's gotten back from school. And she walks up to her mom, and she curses her up and down a blue streak, and then walks down the hallway and storms off, slams the door, and goes into a bedroom. And if you're familiar with how trailers are laid out, you have those big rooms and you have that little hallway. So she storms off.
Yeah.
Not 2 minutes later, she walks back in the front door, and she's like, "Hey, Mom, how's everything going?" And her mom's like, "What are you talking about?
Manic?
You were just here 2 minutes ago cursing me up a blue streak." And she said, "I'm not here." And the person who called in was the young girl who had grown to her 20s. So she had no reason to make the story up to me. And that's a lot of times what we have is we have stories that there's two possible explanations. I mean, because some things could be like, you could be misinterpreting things. Sometimes, a squeak needs some 3-in-1 oil or WD-40, really dating myself there, 3-in-1 oil. Or maybe it needs, bad electrical or a leaky faucet or something. But some of these stories are elaborate enough that either the person's making it up or they're telling the truth, and they have experience something that right now our best term for it is paranormal. Maybe it's the science of the 24th century that we don't understand yet. Maybe there's a multiverse, and maybe there was a glitch. Right. And in that other universe, the young woman was cursing out, the woman for real.
That's one of those things I've talked about a lot because of all the string theory stuff. But, when that first story you gave about the doppelganger, spooning with a doppelganger, spooning with a demon, I can't help but draw a parallel to scam calls, because there's the spoofing where they are able to utilize the number of somebody they are being a doppelganger. Right. And almost like so now you're spooning with somebody that's got a scam, and they're trying to sell you demonic timeshares or something to that effect.
No, but I like that, because it's like demonic con artists of some type. What do they want? Your soul? I don't know. I don't know.
It can't be good.
No, it can't be good. And that's the thing. People think, because first of all, I am a believer. I always say, if you equate it to a gas gauge in a car, I'm 3/4 full. That doesn't mean that I believe every single thing, but I believe more things than I don't believe. So I'm in the believer camp. There's no question about that. But with many of these stories, either these people have experienced something that is real and it falls into that paranormal or science of the 24th century, or they're making it up. And the vast, vast majority of people, I think, are being very sincere about what they've experienced. I mean, I worked in the corporate world for almost 20 years, and I was used to people lying to me. And I think most people are being very sincere when they call in. And I try to start with the campfire. I start with the default is belief.
Right. Yeah. And I agree with you about people's sincerity. One of the things I was curious about in my time listening and just all these different stories, one of the ones that really touched me, and one of the things I really do like, as you said, it is a smorgasbord of different experiences. They're not all the spooky things. There's some of them are the heartwarming things. Some of the pet stories. There was one fairly recently about a fellow who he couldn't replace his dog, but his dog kind of came back to him in a way and gave him all these signs about, hey. And if I recall correctly, it was a Muppet there was a Muppet name and everything.
Right.
That one has stuck with me because sometimes you hear stories, and just because you're being inundated with so many stories, you can't remember them all. I'm
No.
really curious. What are some of the ones that have just really stuck with you? Do you find that there's just some that just they don't let go?
Well, there's one story that maybe we should save it for the end, because if you're going to ask me my favorite story, it's
Sure.
that one.
There we
And
go.
I've told it on about every podcast I'm on. I feel like well, I don't know if I should say this. I feel like I owe the storyteller a royalty because I've told so many times, but it's such a great, but she knows I've told her this. But it's such a great story. But another one that stuck with me actually happened in Ohio here. I'm based in the Cleveland area. And anyway, this woman worked at, and it kind of ties into something we were talking about earlier. This woman worked as I think a respiratory therapist at a hospital in Ohio. It was major, big city hospital. I know which one it is, but I'm not telling. But anyway, the point being, one day she was working with a patient, and her and a gentleman from transport, the people who move the beds around, were taking a patient to a test. So as you do, she went with the transport guy. They wheeled this big hospital bed into this big freight elevator. And across the hallway from the freight elevator was a traditional passenger elevator. And the woman, the respiratory therapist, she looks up and she sees the back of a woman going into the elevator. And she's like, wow, she looks familiar. And then she turns around, this other woman, and she realizes that the woman she's seeing walking into the passenger elevator is her. And she's looking directly at herself. And this woman, obviously on the passenger elevator, sees her and looks back just as intently, kind of like, what's going on? Wow, what's going on? So anyway, when you're at work and something weird happens, you still have a job to do, right?
Right.
So she goes and does the test with this patient, sees all of her patients, does all of her work. It's the end of a hard day. She's tired. So she's standing with a group of people at a passenger elevator, and she's just dog tired. She walks in with this group of people, and she turns around and she sees the freight elevator. And in the freight elevator, she sees a transport worker with a patient, and there's a woman with them who's a therapist of some type, and the woman is her from earlier in the day.
Ugh.
So she got
multiple encounters with herself.
Yeah.
That's the wildest thing to me about that story. I mean, it's a wild story from the get-go,
right?
But that it happens twice,
right,
like that. That's so.
And this is a perfect example of what I said. It's not something that could be misinterpreted as a light in the sky. It's not something that could be misinterpreted as, bad electrical. I mean, either it happened or it didn't. And if it did happen, where are we at now?
And even if it is one of those, because Brendan and I, we have called each other and sent each other photos. For a while, several friends living in Pittsburgh were sending me photos of a guy who rode the city bus that looked it was convincing. But this is at your place. This is another employee. This isn't just somebody that bears an uncanny resemblance.
It's you.
2 years.
Yeah.
It's you.
Yeah,
That's
it's
so.
you. And
that would stick with me.
And
That's
I believe
that's
her,
going
by
to
the
stick
way.
with
I
me.
believe the woman.
Right, because I think one of the interesting things, especially with the campfire, and you really do get it in these books, in the books too, and I'm sure we'll talk more about the campfire series of books in a little bit here, but like you have managed to, like, I think, talk to people from every walk of life, every profession, probably every country at this point, it seems like, and it's these experiences come from all different types of people. And I think that kind of speaks to a little bit of like a universality to these phenomena. And I think that does a lot to dispel some of the I would say like not shame, but some of the weird feelings people have about
Stigma.
the stigma. Thank you. Yes. About talking about these stories. Because if you listen to one episode of the Campfire, you hear everyone from, again, respiratory, like you said, respiratory therapists to doctors to police officers, people just working, bagging groceries down the corner. And, everyone is having these experiences. And do you find that the work that you do and having these conversations gets people to open up more? Like, is there almost like a therapeutic element to having these kinds of stories out there?
I think so. Now, I want to be clear. I don't claim to be a therapist, a psychic, a guru,
Right.
nothing. I'm just a guy who helps people tell stories and does interviews and things. So I want to be clear. I'm not claiming to be a therapist. I'm not a therapist. But is there a certain amount of catharsis that happens with these? I think so. Because honestly, when I started this show back in 2009, because I'd been doing the paranormal podcast for almost 4 years at that point, it was just because I didn't have a guest that week.
Right.
And I thought, oh, this will be a great thing to have people call in. I didn't think it was going to turn into a thing. And it's kind of turned into the thing,
right?
For me at least. But the point being that I thought, oh, it'll be fun. We'll get around the campfire, la la la, da da da. And surprisingly, for some people it is that it's it's entertaining and so forth. And then for some people, I found it means a lot more to them than that. And if that provides people some kind of comfort, I know many times. I think that people, when we talk about the contact stories with loved ones and things, I do think that helps provide comfort. The pet stories, like you talked about, Nick, I think that if it can help people in some way, that's a nice side effect. I'm not necessarily shooting for that because, I don't plan to. I'm not saying I'm a therapist because I am not. But if people get something from it and it helps them in some way. That's great. And a totally unexpected kind of side effect of doing the show.
Well, you kind of said a couple things there that brought something that recently happened with myself, and that was meeting somebody that listened first. I'd never met before, but was very familiar. Hi, Leah. And I'm kind of curious, what are those experiences like? When you're going about and meeting those people for whom it has meant a lot, I'm just kind of curious what that's been like.
It's funny. I'm constantly surprised. I'm like, really? Really?
Yeah.
I just did Monster Fest here in Ohio, which was a great event. And, people called up and there were people who traveled from a long way away to get a chance to chat. And, that to me is just, so nice. And that's the thing that my wife and I talk about all the time is how nice the listeners are. And I mean, maybe over the years, I've gotten literally a handful of people who have not been pleasant. But that's out of thousands and thousands and thousands of interactions and people.
I'm curious as to what their complaint is, because you seem so mellow. You always seem so polite.
I mean, nobody can please everybody.
Right.
It's true.
This is the truth.
You can't please everybody, and I'm not perfect. And some people are like, the stories aren't scary enough, and it's like the stories are what they are.
Right.
My whole thing is that I'm not going to say, hey, come on, make it a little scary. Add a few more like ghosts in there and
we can
some
write
speaking in
scary
tongues,
stuff.
Yeah. Exactly. I love horror movies. In fact, it's funny. It's a big point of contention in my house because I like horror movies. My youngest daughter likes horror movies. My oldest daughter likes them as well. My wife loathes them.
Really? Oh, I didn't realize
which is funny.
Yeah.
But the thing is that I enjoy them, but I enjoy them for what they are. They are fiction. This is not a horror movie. If you want to experience audio drama of the horror variety, this is not it.
Right.
This is basically real people. And the thing that I love about it is that authenticity. Because I believe almost everybody has a story, and I've talked to other podcasters that in this genre that have a similar experience. They'll talk to somebody who's a big skeptic. It's like, I don't believe in any of this stuff. And, well, there was this one time, and then they tell you like this incredible, like, scarier than any kind of thing out there. And it's okay to be, I'm fine with people being skeptical.
Right.
We've had Dr. Michael Shermer on the program, for example, on the Paranormal Podcast. Actually, I really enjoyed having him on the show. We disagreed, but he was a real gentleman about it, and he's willing to have a conversation. And that, at the end of the day, is all that I ask.
Well, he's oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
On.
I was just going to say one thing real quick. The funny thing about them, though, Scientific American, when I talk about him, I always point this out. He had a story about his possible paranormal experience.
Was this on a bike ride?
No, that might be something different. This had to do with when he got married and a radio that we were talking about radios earlier that didn't work. And I don't want to ruin the story, but it's in Scientific America. And it's about a radio, and his wife had a radio that was from her grandpa, I guess it was. And she loved her grandpa. He had passed, and she had wished that he would have been there that day for the wedding. And somehow they ended up playing that radio, and it worked for the first time in years, and it never worked again. And here it is. Anomalous events that can shake one's skepticism to the core. Scientific American. I'll send you guys a link.
Oh,
but
please.
It's like even the great Michael Shermer, who is, he's one of the top skeptics of all time. Even he, has his paranormal story.
Well, and I've always liked him just because he will have the conversations with people, because I do think he is there is the sincerity. He's eagerly looking for the truth. And I think he said something to the fact that he would like to live sometime in the world where there were these things, but he's a really interesting character. I know I've cited him a lot here, but he does these transcontinental bike races where they race from California all the way. And he talks about just what that does to one's mind. And he says he compares it sometimes to religious experiences because it's transformative and you get in this weird space.
Well, you know what that reminds me of? Are you guys familiar with the third man phenomena?
I'm familiar with the movie.
So basically, this has happened to mountain climbers who have been in distress, for example. And there'll be like a couple people there, and they'll sense that there's a third person there trying to assist them, but there's no one there.
One of the scariest, or not scary, it's endearing, but it is very spooky to me. I believe it was an Unsolved Mysteries segment, was very similar to that, where a young boy and his mom were in a car wreck, and his mother died, unfortunately, in the accident. They rolled down a hill, but he sat in the car. He was in the car in a child seat for like 3 days. But he talks about his mom coming to him, there was a person coming to him. But the mountaineering aspect, that is a weird one.
Yeah, the third man phenomena. I mean, there was a whole book written about it, and I think it was by maybe a psychologist or something. It wasn't somebody who was spooky. It was like, it's a known thing, and it is. And then in this book, we have one of a crisis apparition. It's about a woman and she was a grown woman at this point, and her father liked to mountain climb. And this particular night, and I'm trying to remember as much of this I can off the top of my head, but basically the idea is that he was on this climb and he was having a really hard time because he thought it was going to be a simple climb. So maybe he didn't pack the way that he should have, or those kind of things.
I've been there.
So he broke down and had hypothermia. And, at one point he was, it was touch and go. He could have died. And at about that same time, he had a vision that he was talking to his daughter and telling her that he loved her. At that same time, his daughter had kind of this sense or vision of her father standing over her.
Wow.
Saying, "I love you." So after he did make it off the mountain, they got together for tea or something, and they compared notes, and they realized what happened, that they had both seen each other at the same time when he was at his highest level of peril. And it's a crisis apparition. So I mean, I believe that there's a lot going on that we can't understand, and that gets into, and I hate, I know a lot of times people in the paranormal throw out, string theory or like a lot of scientific terms they don't understand. But what it does remind me of that whole idea of co-location, right?
Right. Yep.
The thing that, and I think this goes back to Einstein, maybe.
Yeah, quantum entanglement, spooky action
the
at a
idea
distance.
that it can be at two places at one time. I mean, is this something like that on the macro level?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Those kind of stories are so fascinating because they're kind of, for me, something like that, which is, again, it's scary from a narrative sense, but it's heartwarming that like they were able to have that experience, and it kind of implies that there is like a mechanism out there, and that's something we talk about a lot, like this, like you said, I think like 24th century technology. Maybe that's the kind of thing we will figure out someday. There is a way that it's working.
Even if we can't explain a mechanism for it, there's no doubt to me that crisis apparition there wasn't a big part of what got that person down. Whether it's something that we're manifesting or whether it's some other thing, the mechanics of it are irrelevant to the fact that in that moment that seemed to be what was needed.
Right. Yeah, whatever works kind of thing, right?
Right.
And I have often thought this. First of all, I am a believer in the afterlife, and I believe that our deceased loved ones can come to us and get messages to us. And I've had weird synchronicities where like a weird number of things had to line up perfectly. I can't even tell one of those stories. I believe it was my loved one. Now, let's say I'm wrong. Let's say it wasn't. I mean, it's not like I'm spending my life savings to prove it or something. If that makes me feel better, is that necessarily a bad thing? I'll tell you what happened to me.
Yes, please.
I was on a paranormal cruise a few years, 2017, I think. And
that sounds fun.
Yeah, well, it was 3 or 4 different speakers in the paranormal world. One of them was the late great Rosemary Ellen Guiley, who was fantastic. Other one was Micah Hanks, who does some paranormal stuff. He does, even though I put UFOs in the paranormal, he's really focused on the UFO question. So we were, the speakers were this group of people who were attending this paranormal cruise. So anyway, we had one day where we were in the conference room during the sea day, and during the day we were all doing little talks. So my turn was coming up, and I had a little bit of a cold, so before COVID, so it wasn't that. And I decided I'm going to go to the cafe and get some coffee to warm up my throat before I have to talk. So anyway, I'm going through the casino, and I see one of the members of our group playing this crane game. It's like the claw that goes down and tries to grab money in the casino. I was walking through the casino. And I had a very intentional thought at that moment, man, I wish my uncle were here. A very important figure in my life was my one uncle. And he was like a second dad to me. And he had passed in 2013. And he loved these claw games in stores. When you went into a store and saw stuffed animals, he would spend like $10, $15 trying to win one of the stupid stuffed animals. He didn't really want it. He just wanted to beat the machine. So I thought, oh man. And like I said, he really was like a second dad to me. And my dad knows that. And I thought, man, I wish he were here. Man, I wish he were here. And all of a sudden, the guy's playing away from our group. This woman comes up next to the machine and she goes, John. And her husband or whoever it was comes over. My uncle's name, John.
Ugh.
Now,
that's weird.
The hardcore skeptic would say, Jim, it was just a blind coincidence.
But an exotic name like John?
Yeah. But if you think about it, I had to be walking through at that time. That guy had to be playing for me to notice. That woman had to lose whoever she had, and his happened to have to be named John. To me, that was me putting out, boy, I wish you were really here. And he was kind of saying, well, I kind of am. Now, again, I lean towards that was a sign. Some people would say, Jim, you're dreaming. But if I'm dreaming and it makes me feel better, I don't see any harm to it.
Yeah, right. I think that, and that's I think for me, the difference between a coincidence and like a synchronicity, as people
Right.
say, where it's like, if it means something to you, if it feels like something, then it is. And like for people that notice those, not say often in their life, but when you notice them, they seem to be impactful, and that doesn't hurt anybody. It's not like you said, you're not like going and spending money at the casino after that or anything, because
Right.
you're like, oh my, John's with
Yeah,
me,
I'm
kind of thing.
gonna spend $1,000 here. I'm gonna
Yeah,
win.
yeah,
Like that, yeah.
exactly. I think that the being open to those things and trusting your own instinct enough to accept that as like, yeah, that's a nice thing that just happened, um, is just generally a good thing for people. And there's not a lot of harm in it. And because I mean, there are stories I think people have of having weird synchronicities or things happening that are kind of like omens or warnings, or
I have
but
one of those too.
oh, okay, I'd love to hear that one then. Yeah,
Okay,
so
well,
on the
this
other side
goes
of the
way back,
spectrum.
way before podcasting. I was a teenager. I was actually visiting family in West Virginia, because I grew up in Ohio, but my family was from West Virginia. Anyway, so I was visiting, and apparently there was this one young lady who had seen me and said, "Hey, told my cousin, I'd like to talk to him." I'm like, "Hey, young lady wants to talk to me. I'm not going
Right.
to turn her down." So anyway, we were walking and getting to know each other, and it was a rural, like, blacktop road, not even big enough to have a stripe down the middle,
Right.
and little houses around. And there was this huge log truck, the one with the big chains and everything, parked, and it was stacked up with logs. And we approached it, and then we split up like bread and butter, walked around it, and past it. And while I was walking around it, something told me, maybe not audibly, but I felt that I really need to get away from this log truck. I really need to get away from it. So, after we're done, after we get past the log truck, I'm not thinking about it anymore. I'm trying to buddy up to this young lady, being a red-blooded guy there, Well, anyway, we walk about 20 feet, and I hear a big rumble, and every log on that truck on the side I was walking had fallen off. And
wow.
Again, this is before before podcast existed.
Yeah.
I had an interest in the paranormal, but it wasn't
Yeah.
like an obsession. And that really happened. And I told
Yeah.
that story years before I ever podcast. Now, again, it could be a coincidence,
Mhm.
or a skeptic might say, Jim, you heard very faintly the chains stressing out and cracking.
Yeah.
And subconscious mind said, get away. Maybe. But I thought something or someone was telling me to move.
Right.
Yeah, and I think so many people have had experiences like that, not as dramatic as tons
Right.
of logs rolling over, but just the premonition that something, like, I shouldn't do something, and they do it either way and reap the rewards of that or not. It is a really wild thing, and I'm kind of wondering. We had spoken once, or a couple times actually, with Thomas White around here, and he speaks a lot about, for folklore and story collection, this region is very rich for a variety of reasons. And I'm really curious if what you make of, we've talked about West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio because we're all in this
Mhm.
area. Do you think there is something about the people or the place that maybe led you to this, or that you
yeah.
just started hearing these stories? What do you make of it?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Actually, I draw a direct line, and I've said this before. It's funny you bring it up synchronistically, but and I was a weird kid. Okay. I love talk radio. I mean, I was just a weird kid.
Can I
Cool
pause
kid.
you
Cool
real
kids.
quick?
Yeah.
Let me pause you real quick, because my friend Denunzio and I,
Yeah.
KDKA, listen to KDKA, listen to WBRE, the polka shows out of Cleveland, and there's a German program out of Cleveland, and there was a meet and greet thing at something down in Pittsburgh, and my friend Denunzio and I went and we talked to the host, and we said it was Mike Pintek, the guy who broke the 3 Mile story,
Hmm.
and we were like 17, and he looked at us like really skeptical for a while. And then in college, I was sitting at dinner with a lady I knew. I was buddying up with her, and she was talking to her friend, and she had to spell her last name for somebody. It was a weird Russian last name. And I said, "Oh, like the radio guy on KDKA." And she goes, "Yeah, that's my dad. How do you know that?" I'm like, "Oh, I listen to him all the time." And she's like, "Only oh." So no, I'm well there with you. I am sorry to interrupt, but
No,
yeah, the
no,
kids
I would,
listening to the
I
AM.
yeah.
Right.
So I loved, I mean, by the way, KDKA, as I understand it, the only radio station to begin with a K east of the Mississippi.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I thought there was I forget if there's one more or if this is like, well, which one was the first, but
Yeah, I
yeah,
think
it's
KDKA
definitely the
was the first
biggest.
station. Yeah, I think
First
it was.
commercially licensed, yeah.
Yeah. But to my point, I used to love to listen to Larry King, not on CNN, but when he was at the Mutual Broadcasting Network, Larry King. But anyway, I love stories. And one of my favorite parts when I would go see because we would spend like almost a month every year in West Virginia. And the thing that I would love, and most kids would be running away with their ears bleeding, but I love to sit with the older people. And when night fell, and you have the bugs flying around and the porch light is on, and they would swap stories.
Oh.
And some of those stories were just crazy things that happened to them. But once in a while, you get one of those spooky ones. And that was, I just loved that. So maybe on some level, I think that may have stuck with me. And that's why I kind of really enjoy getting people's stories. And something I've done a few live events. And when I do those, I say, one of the things I want to leave with you, since we talked about campfire stories tonight, is share your stories. You talk about folklore and collecting stories with your family. Share your stories, share your experiences, record them, do those kind of things. Who was the guy who did all the folk music, recorded it? Alan Lomax, was it?
Alan Lomax, Alan
yep.
and his father, and these things are the threads that bind us.
Right. So my point being, whether you call to my show or not is immaterial. I'd love to have you on to tell your story. But tell your stories, whether they're paranormal or not. I think that's part of our humanity. And that's part of us that can live on, because I still remember stories that my grandparents told me and my aunts and uncles who have passed away, and they survive in me. And I hope I pass those stories along to my kids. It's so important to share that oral tradition. So, yeah, I guess I come by it kind of honestly, because that was, people, I've got a deck, but you used to have a porch. And when you had a porch, everybody gathered together and told those stories. And I think somewhere between the deck and the porch, we lost something as a society.
No, I think
I've never phrased it like that, but yeah,
that's a good way of putting it. I really like that. And I really do think you're onto something there, because like when it comes to especially like the spooky or paranormal stories, not that like, because again, all the stories are important, but they're, for some of us, those are the stories early on that we hear in various forms, whether it's from people around your community or, watching, In Search Of, or,
that was my show that got me started.
Right. Like those things kind of
Nimoy.
those things just resonate with you. And there is a level of like both like comfort in them, I think, for people as like entertainment, but also it, like you said, it kind of helps us feel connected to the people around us, the past, all those things.
Well, it goes to me with you will always listen to the music that got you into music.
Yeah.
You will expand, you will evolve, but you will always be rooted in that. And I feel the same way about stories, because Unsolved Mysteries. When they had a ghost song, I would just stop and watch the whole thing, and In Search Of, the weird theremin noises that they had and everything.
Oh yeah.
Iconic. But just like you will always have the music, you will always go back to the stories that got you interested in stories.
Yeah, absolutely. There were two really spooky stories that my parents told that really kind of locked me into it. One was a ghost story, one was a UFO story.
Oh, okay.
So I'll quickly tell you the ghost story. So
Please, yeah.
my dad's still with us. He's 88, God bless him. But he worked
Good
in
for
a
him.
steel, like so many people that came up from West Virginia and parts south. He worked in a steel mill for many years. And when he was a young man, I would place this around 1960, he and his brother, John, were working in the steel mill, and they lived over a bar. They had an apartment over a bar.
Yeah.
And it was very modest, very small, couple rooms. My dad slept in one room. My uncle slept in another. And there was basically one door. That was basically it. And they might have had a fire escape. I'm not sure. But anyway, so the one night my dad is, asleep. And my dad was a big guy, played football, 6 foot, probably at that time about 210. I mean, and he was strong. And I know when I was a kid, he scared the hell out of me. But anyway, but the point was, is that, he's a strong, fit guy. And he's laying in bed and he wakes up and he sees an older man leaning over him and smiling. So my dad, he's 25, 26 years old. He's got a big right hand. He takes a big swing, nothing.
Yeah.
He swings with his other arm, nothing. And he's yelling and screaming. He's like, there's somebody in here, John. There's somebody in here. And my uncle uses a few words I won't use here on the broadcast and said, you're just dreaming. You're just going to go to bed. So about 2 weeks later, my dad's asleep. And he hears someone yelling. It's my uncle. And he's like, Jim, because my dad's Jim too. He says, Jim, you got to wake up. There's somebody in there. There's somebody in here.
Oh, jeez.
Same thing happened to my uncle. Now, you got to know, my dad was somebody who would watch In Search of and that kind of thing, kind of like that. And that probably helped him. My uncle had no interest. He didn't believe in any of it. But he swears he saw, and they matched up descriptions. It was the same guy. My dad thinks it might be a guy who used to go to that bar and they bought drinks for, and he passed away. But they both saw him. And the thing about my whole family, and the same goes for this next story I'll tell you real quickly, is that, they weren't into pyramid power. They didn't, they weren't trying to get in touch with the oneness of the universe. Salt of the earth people, worked in a steel mill, not, trying to, do paranormal investigations.
Right.
I totally believe it. And it was just really wild. So anyway, the other story, fast forward probably about 10 years. I was a little baby, and my dad and my mom went back to visit with my grandparents. And they left me with them so they could drive off somewhere to a secluded area. Now, I don't want to know why. I'm sure they were just probably just discussing the politics of the day or something.
Right, of course.
So anyway, they're parked. It's pitch black. All of a sudden, the whole sky lights up. My dad said he could, and still says the same, the stories never change. He could read the speedometer and the analog clock on his 68 Buick LeSabre like he could during pure daylight. And this lasted 30 to 60 seconds.
So a long time. Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Then my dad turns to his left and he sees what he terms a man with a welding mask with his hand up. And then they drive off, and then my mom said, unfortunately, she's not with us anymore, but she said, and I'll try to approximate her accent, then, Jimmy, I saw the biggest birds on the side of the bank I ever saw in my life. And I think that she said there were several feet wingspan, several birds. Now, you got to know about my mom. Like I said, my dad had some interest in this stuff, no doubt. My mom had no interest in it. I don't think she might have believed in ghosts, but I don't think she believed in aliens for a minute.
Let alone Thunderbirds. Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, with her family, it was difficult to convince them that we went to the moon. So, I mean,
yeah, right.
My one uncle said, my dad said, Didn't you see on TV? They went on the moon. I saw on TV. He said, I saw Mickey Mouse too, but that doesn't mean he's real. But anyway, and again, that goes back to tradition. It's a silly thing to say, but it's a fun little thing.
Yeah.
It's a fun little thing to remark on. For the record, even though I got to interview Bart Sibrel, the guy who Buzz Aldrin punched, I do believe we landed on the moon.
There we go.
So anyway, the point being, those are two very powerful stories that I heard probably as long as I could remember, going back to, elementary school, to kindergarten. Stories never changed. The people never changed. I mean, if you know people, and maybe other people out there have had this experience, there's certain people in your life, they never change. Right. I mean, my dad, my uncle, my mom were the same people in 1976 that they were the two when they passed away. And my dad's the same guy he was in 1976. And I suspect he's the same person he was in 1950. So, right. I mean, these people don't change. They're very solid individuals, and they're not shifting sands kind of people. And those two stories, maybe that did it. I mean, I also say Leonard Nimoy because most people think of Mr. Spock. I think of In Search Of.
Right. No, and those are such wild stories too. And I can imagine how those had, an effect on you whenever you're younger. But also, I think it was probably interesting for you as you're interviewing people over the years, especially like other researchers, hearing these stories, and you go, "Oh, this is like legit high strangeness stuff."
Well, like, the funny thing is that I was interviewing Mike Cleland, who has books out called The Messengers, and it's about owls. And just as I'm interviewing him, my mom's thing about the big birds clicks in.
Yeah.
And I said, could those have been screen memories? And he said, yep.
Yeah.
But there's something missing here. So did they just flew off, and then the Moltar guy walked away? Or how'd that
They just left. They just left. They didn't hang around. They didn't hang around to see.
They were the smart ones.
They're just kind of like, and they thought that it was some explosion or something, and they'd see something on the news. Nothing.
That's wild. So I know that we've talked about a lot of stories here this evening, but you did tease earlier about wanting to share maybe one of your favorite stories.
Yeah.
So with the few minutes we have left, would you mind sharing your top story with us, or one of your top
this is
stories?
my all-time favorite. It's called The Roadhouse Saloon.
Oh, okay. Yep.
So basically, this is about a caller, T.I., and she lives in Michigan, but would every summer go up to like this campground up in Wisconsin. So her and a friend, Bob, decided they wanted to go see a band about an hour away. So they drove an hour away, rural area. They saw the band. It was great. They closed down the place. They actually stayed a little bit later even to talk to the band because they were all musicians. Headed on the way back an hour through this rural area. Everything's closed, very dark, kind of spooky looking anyway. So T.I. says, hey, I got to go to the restroom. And Bob said, you don't have much choice here. You want to pull up a tree maybe if you want to. And she said, no, let's just drive fast. So anyway, they go just a little ways down the road, and they're shocked because there's this bar that's wide open, the Roadhouse Saloon. And neon signs, cars in the parking lot, the joints jumping, the thump, thump, thump of music. And it's like, wait a minute, this is well past closing time, 3 or 3:30 in the morning. They're not supposed to be open, but let's not look a gift horse in the mouth. So they pull in. So they go in. Bob goes to get a couple of soft drinks at the bar. T.I. goes to the restroom. She comes back, and they sit down a minute. And they're talking. So Bob says, I'm really glad I came here because they have this like well-known mural on this one whole wall of the Old West. And I've always wanted to see it, and I never got to see it. So they're looking at it, and it's kind of weird because, first of all, the people in the place are kind of like smiling, and they're not really interacting, kind of weirdly. And then they notice that the people in the painting are represented by the real people in the bar. There's a bunch of guys in the painting playing, dressed up like cowboys, playing cards. They're playing pool over here. There's a woman standing over here. In the picture, she's a dance hall girl. So that's kind of weird. Then all of a sudden, they notice there's this big Wurlitzer beautiful bubbler jukebox. Some guy puts on Chubby Checkers' Let's Twist Again. walks over to T.I., smiles, has a mouthful of rotten teeth, and says, "Want to dance?" T.I. holds up her cane and says, "I don't do much dancing." And she was glad she had that cane. So here's where it starts to get a little weird. So they're looking at this painting, and they have the old double doors, the swinging doors, like you go into a saloon. "I want to see the sheriff," that kind of thing. And they're kind of thinking, this is weird. There's some figures or some misty columns in there we didn't notice before. And they turn away and look a little bit more. And they're kind of developing like a Polaroid picture into a figure. One appears to be a man and one appears to be a woman. It's like, this is really weird. They look a little more, and it's decidedly a taller man, shorter woman. The woman has curly hair. T.I. has curly hair. The woman has cowboy boots. T.I. has cowboy boots. The figure in the painting has a cane. And T.I. says, "Well, this is not a coincidence. Let's get out of here." So they go to get out, and the people are like beckoning, "Come back, come back," kind of motioning, "Come back." They close the door. Everything goes pitch black, like the place was never open. Silent, neon signs off, everything. They turn around to the parking lot, and there are singular in the parking lot. One car, their car. They leave. T.I.'s a lot braver than I am. 2 or 3 days later, she comes back, and with a friend, which, yeah, Nick is shaking his head. No, I wouldn't do that either. Either a friend or a sister. They make one concession. They go back at about 8 o'clock. So anyway, jukebox, CD jukebox, not a Wurlitzer classic bubbler with vinyl. No chubby checker on the jukebox. I thought, whoa, this is weird. Painting, no figures where the doors were. Everything else is the same, but no Bob and T.I. And they go and talk to the bartender. Bartender's a young woman. T.I. says, "Boy, I was in here the other night. The joint was jumping, and there was this young, good-looking, strapping, like farm boy bartending." The woman's like, "I'm sorry. Me and my elderly father are the only one that bartend this place." And with that, T.I. left the Roadhouse Saloon. A denouement of sorts. That was 2010, 2011. She told that. I traveled up to Michigan, met her in person in 2019. She told the story face to face. It's on my YouTube channel. I believe her 100%.
It sounds like I've read a book. I mean,
a lot of people
came off the pages of Stephen King. Or
yeah,
Clive
well, actually,
Barker.
a lot of people compare it to They've Got a Hell of a Band. Stephen King.
Yeah. Oh, I see. I was thinking of Clive Barker's Cold Heart Canyon, where there's a mural that kind of sucks people in.
But by the way, a couple of things.
Wild story.
One, I know we're short on time.
Yeah.
One, the place exists. It
right.
was a real place. Chad Lewis got pictures of it and of the painting, and those are in that video. So the place
I want to see the
really
reviews.
exists. Yeah, it's real. It's real. It's a real place.
So yeah, if people want to see that video, I assume you have a YouTube channel, obviously.
I do.
Where else can people? I mean, everywhere, I would think. But where would you point people if they want to either read your book, see the videos, listen to the podcasts?
JimHarold.com, and they can look me up on any podcast player, Jim Harold, Harold. And then the YouTube channel is youtube.com/Jim Harold. And thanks, guys, for having me on the show. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jim. You have yourself a good night, okay?
You do as well. And stay spooky.